Thank you, Mike, for that introduction, and thank you to President Mike Collins and the BSHM for the invitation to speak on the CT scanner, one of the greatest medical engineering developments of the 20th century. It's particularly appropriate for me to actually be talking today because in just under 2 weeks we will celebrate the 50th anniversary of the first ever clinical CT scan. So let's just see where our story starts, shall we? Okay, that's right.
I should have dimmed the lights.
It's all right. My problem. If I'd known. Thanks, Alex. Thanks very much.
Okay.
Disadvantage, I can't see you as well now, but never mind. Our story starts with a gentleman called Godfrey Hounsfield, who in about 1967 was asked to think about things in the area of pattern recognition. And instead of just thinking about could he recognise patterns and characters on a page, he started to think, could he actually recognise what was inside a solid object or a box by actually taking lots and lots of readings through that box? Sorry, I'm just going to put up a laser pointer on here for myself. Thank you. So he was taking lots and lots of readings through the box and considering the volume as a series of slices. In October 1968, he put a proposal to the hierarchy in EMI, his bosses in the Central Research Laboratories, the proposal, an improved form of X-radiography. In this proposal, he was already considering the object as a series of slices and watching how things changed across the slices in the object. But even in this early proposal, before any experimentation, Godfrey stated that he would achieve higher accuracy in measurement of absorption and discrimination of different differences across the structure being imaged. But he recognised that he would suffer from poorer spatial resolution, that is, poorer ability to see fine structures. And everybody at the time was trying to improve and get better spatial resolution. In the proposal, Hounsfield already forecast that after the concept of the basic scanning was proved with the technology and components that were available at the time, new components would be developed that would improve and speed up the whole process. He also specified in his early proposal that it would be possible to achieve even a complete bank of detectors, which of course is what we now have in modern day CT scanning. It's interesting that in his early diagrams he was showing the shape of the body, but people were saying to him that the greatest challenge was the head. So he started by focusing on the head. Well, let's hear what Godfrey actually had to say himself.
Impressive that I show you some of the early pieces of equipment that I used for testing the principles of the scanner in the early days. As it happened, an old lathe bed was available in the lab, and by using discarded equipment also found around, I was able to build this lab test machine which would demonstrate the principle of the system. The early tests used a radioactive source, but later this X-ray tube was used to speed up the process. The X-ray tube and detector scanned backwards and forwards while the collimated beam was passing through the object to be scanned. In this case, it was a pickle brain in a box. At the end of each stroke, the object was rotated through one degree. This process then went on for 180 degrees, and it took about 6 hours to complete a picture. Values given by the detector were recorded on paper tape and passed to a computer. This mathematically reconstructed a picture of the density of each pixel of the material within the slice. This is the first rather incomplete picture we took of this pickle brain, showing a tumour at 3 different window heights. Later, all manner of things were scanned, including cows' brains, pigs' bodies, bones, tumours, and many other things, which led us to believe that a clinical machine would have been quite worthwhile building. Although my work was vigorously supported by the Department of Health, I thought I'd better go around a few hospitals and find out exactly what they thought about the system. I found it very discouraging. Many of these radiologists didn't seem to grasp the point that this would have certain advantages. And I remember reporting back that we would be lucky to make about 20 of these machines. Incidentally, I was wrong. So eventually a clinical machine was built, and this is one of the first production models, similar to the one used at Axton Hospital, Wimbledon, which was the first head scanner to be tested. There are several ways: the X-ray tube and 2 detectors scan backwards and forwards across the head. A whole assembly rotating 180 degrees around the patient. The patient put his head in a rubber bag which was surrounded by water. This technique improved the accuracy of the absolute values of density recorded on the picture. It is interesting to note that these absolute values produced by this technique were more accurate than the modern machines, but there were disadvantages, particularly when the water bag burst and 2.5 litres of water in the patient. As the machine only had 2 detectors, it was very slow. It took 2.5 minutes to take 2 pictures side by side. This is a well-known picture of the first patient to be diagnosed with this machine. It shows a cyst in the frontal lobe. The machine was an immediate success, and here are some of the pictures that followed, taken by Dr. Ambrose. Originally, the pictures were to be sent over telephone lines to a central processor, but the arrival of the mini-computer giving the ability to process pictures on site saved the day. Picture could be then processed within the time of one patient being scanned, and it was recorded on Polaroid film. The success of the brain scanner led on to the production of a whole-body scanner. I was very pleased when it took a very handsome picture of myself when it was tested in the laboratory for the first time. Although a little slow, 18 seconds to take a picture, the clinical results were accepted by all with enthusiasm.
Well, that's hearing it from Godfrey himself. And as Godfrey mentioned, the actual early system was actually created from bits, the base of a lathe and other, he said, discarded components left lying around the laboratory. Well, who would do that unless they were very, very short of funds and very, very good at improvisation, as Godfrey was? This was the image of the brain specimen which he showed to people and which most people couldn't appreciate the significance of. But, fortunately, one person did, Jamie Ambrose. Jamie Ambrose, the radiologist, you can see him here in his white coat, became a key member of the original team and fundamental to the development of this clinical scanner. But even the first clinical scanner was done on a shoestring budget. There wasn't a dedicated, custom-made table for the patient. This is a modified dentist chair that you're looking at there. But fortunately, that did achieve the first ever CT scan of a patient, a lady, taken on the 1st of October 1971 at Atkinson Morley Hospital. And by September 1973, there were 10 systems installed around the world. 4 in the UK, 4 in the USA, 1 in Canada, and 1 in Sweden. But the whole project could so easily have failed. At every stage, not just the technology challenges and hurdles at the time, but also the funding. Because as you've gathered, there just wasn't very much funding. Funding could have been refused. As Godfrey said, most of the people didn't appreciate the concept. And 99% of the people in radiology and in industry were against any loss of spatial resolution. Many people have heard stories about the fact that the funding of the clinical scanner was funded by EMI because they had lots of money from Beatles records. Well, nothing could be further from the truth. The senior people in EMI believed that they're making money in music, put more money into music and make even more money there. Why invest into medical engineering, an area they knew nothing about and Godfrey knew nothing about? But fortunately, it was developed. So let's take a few minutes, since this session is looking at engineering, at the basics of the technology. Godfrey mentioned that there was a detector. Well, he talked about two. That's because they were actually doing two slices at the same time. There were two in that direction, but there was a single detector looking across at an X-ray tube on the other side of the gantry. And the gantry would move across the patient, taking lots and lots of readings as it went. Then it would index, initially by 1 degree, then move back across the patient, taking another set of readings. Then index by 1 degree, move back. This was called translate and then rotate. Godfrey chose this technology because at the end of each of the translate motions, the X-ray beam passed just through a known amount of air and water, so the value from the detectors could be calibrated and hence give the accurate values he talked about. But as it translated across, it took 160 different readings. Then it would index by 1 degree, translate across another 160 readings. And it repeated those indexes through 180 degrees. So that gave us a total of 28,800 readings. But this mechanism of going across, index, across, was very, very slow and resulted in the fact that a scan, albeit of two slices, took between 4.5 and 20 minutes to complete. So the development then went on to the next generation. We were playing a generation game at this time. And here we had an X-ray tube, but we now had a row of detectors, initially 8 detectors per slice, which would then translate across an index. We could now, because we had a fan beam and 8 detectors, index by a greater degree. We could index by 3 degree increments, so fewer movements. This sped up the scanner to give us a scan in between 1 minute and 5 minutes 20 seconds. Then that was the early head scanner, no water bag now. But the next version, and Godfrey showed you the images of his body, was the first EMI body scanner, which was installed in Northwick Park Hospital in Harrow. And this now had a bank of, or a row of 30 detectors and did 10 degree increments between each translate motion. So it sped up between 10 and 20 seconds per scan. But 20 seconds for a lung scan, ask a patient who's not well to hold their breath for 20 seconds for each slice to minimise motion artefacts. Not easy. So another generation was developed. Rotate, rotate. Here, there's an X-ray tube on one side, an arc of detectors on the other, and they rotate around the patient. In fact, this was a technology that Godfrey considered very early on. But he was concerned because in those days, detectors weren't good, and they would drift. And the detectors that were in the centre here of the arc were only ever seeing X-rays which had passed through the patient, so they couldn't be calibrated. The result was ring patterns, known as ring artifacts in the images. In fact, modern CT scanners are based on this technology, but with much, much improved detectors. So, in the early scanner, the X-ray tube and the detectors would rotate around either 180 or 360 degrees. Then the cables that were attached to the X-ray tube and the detectors meant it would have to rotate back and then back again. Fortunately, the introduction of slip ring technology some years ago has enabled continuous rotation, and modern scanners use that together with the fact that the patient table can actually move in through the aperture in the gantry, and the result is that we get a sort of helical pattern of the X-ray beam around the patient, hence modern spiral scanners. As I said, detectors have significantly improved. The very early scanner used photomultiplier tubes about this size, so very poor resolution, with sodium iodide. But crystals, not only have we gone from photomultipliers down now to photodiodes, which are very, very much smaller, but crystals have improved in their ability to convert from X-rays through to, well, the whole detector assembly through to the electrical signal that's fed to the electronics and the computer. Modern scanners have banks of detectors. They have multiple rows, so you have a row going, for example, between the two blue dots there, a row between the two yellow, etc. This has created, of course, a bank of detectors, just like Godfrey predicted in his original proposal. Another area that has significantly improved over the time has been computers. From the very early ICL 1905 mainframe computer that was used for the first image, through to the mini computers, the Nova and Eclipse Data General that Godfrey mentioned in the video. By the late 1970s, a single board image array processor was being used for processing CT images. Over the following decades, computers have got smaller, faster and more powerful, to the point now that single integrated circuit chips, and even the smartphones that you're probably all carrying, have more power and speed than that early ICL mainframe computer. There have in fact been a large number of enhancements and improvements in all areas of CT since the 1970s. The key thing to me, which I find so interesting, is that many of these were actually predicted by Godfrey Hounsfield, either in his original proposal or in his very, very early note lab books. So let's learn a little bit more about Godfrey, particularly since we're in the area of Sheffield. Godfrey's family can actually be traced back to the village of Dronfield, which is about 6 miles south of us here. And in Dronfield is where there's a manor of Hounsfield. And the old original moated house, Hounsfield Hall, which became known as Holmesfield, still existed there in 1943, as this picture shows. A more recent picture from Google Maps shows that that old moated house is now, I'm not sure whether it's a pub or a hotel there. There are many old roads and references in the general area around Sheffield with the name Hounsfield spelled in one of a variation of ways. We can actually trace Godfrey back to Brimington, where in the early 1600s one Bartholomew Hounsfield was born. And it's through Bartholomew's great-great-grandson Thomas and Thomas's son James that we can actually trace Godfrey's heritage. In 1919, Godfrey's father Thomas became a farmer in the village of Sutton-on-Trent. I suppose that's about 30 miles southeast of us here. That was actually the year that Godfrey was born. And I do believe that being brought up on a farm with little money set a complete framework for Godfrey throughout his life. You can see him in this picture, sitting on his mother's knee with his father and 3 of his siblings. His eldest sister, Molly, is missing from that photograph. Godfrey was not, however, an academic or good at school, as a report from his school just before he left school refers to Godfrey's bad work was due to intellectual retardation. But he did love to experiment. And Godfrey was very good at experimenting, but he never did things by halves. You can see a first attempt at rockets here, where he was using a cocoa tin inside a Tate & Lyle syrup tin. That was successful. But he wasn't happy, so he then did a second attempt using a water trough on his farmer's farm. Well, that was 100 times more successful, but it did destroy the water trough, much to the annoyance of his father. Many people recall Godfrey sitting in the corner of his laboratory, focused on whatever project he was working on at the time. But Godfrey was very, very sociable. He joined a number of clubs, and you can see him here in a boating tug of war. I've often wondered whether they actually won the tug of war. I never found out. And on a trip to the Loire, how I would have loved to have been the lady lying there being fed. I'm not sure whether it's grapes or cherries by Godfrey. Godfrey won many, many awards. And you can see him here taking his mother to Buckingham Palace when he received his CBE, and with his two brothers when in 1981 he got his knighthood. Perhaps the most prestigious award was the Nobel Prize for Physiology and Medicine, which he won in 1979, sharing the award jointly with Alan Cormack. Godfrey retired in 1984 from EMI, and you can see he's holding the classic gold clock that's awarded, and his assistant Audrey is holding a hacksaw blade and micrometer. Well, those had some great significance, as is shown by the cartoon on the next slide. This cartoon was drawn by one of Godfrey's colleagues, Tony Williams, and it has the caption, "It is amazing what can be done with a hacksaw and micrometer." Well, that saying is based upon a saying from Godfrey in about 1977. While I don't think the CT scanner actually looks or was built quite like this, with crates, etc., it is certain that it was built initially on scraps and very, very dependent upon the improvised engineering of Godfrey. Godfrey was a fascinating man, unassuming, and he thought in a totally different way to other people. It was my privilege to have known Godfrey and to actually have driven with him to the last BIR conference he attended in Manchester in 2002. Without the intuitive genius of Godfrey and the open-mindedness and positive attitude of Jamie Ambrose, it is highly possible that we would never have had the CT scanner that we know today. Thank you, Godfrey and Jamie and all the team who developed the CT scanner, and thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for joining me in celebrating CT at 50. Thank you.